Let's get a South Carolina football take here on a Monday. We've got Chris Phillips on the line, our South Carolina source. You can catch him on the Daily Crow, the Spurs Up Show. It's every 12 to 2 each and every Monday through Friday. Best way to find it, Chris.
Mark, what's going on, man? I'm very excited to be here. Like we were just talking off air, there's some out there that say you can't take anything from spring games. Even some Gamecocks I talked to said, what's the point, Chris? We don't learn anything. You can't draw conclusions. But as I told you, Mark, and I said it on our podcast, I'm sure I'll reiterate myself this week. For the diehard, everything is important. Every snap matters. Every time your team takes the field, what have you, it's important, and there are takeaways from it, right? I think that's just how we're wired, right? When your football team plays or college football happens, it always matters whether it's a scrimmage, it's a spring game, or it's the national championship. So appreciate you having me on, Mark, and really, really excited to dive into it.
Absolutely. Well, I'll say it like this, at least for me. Every snap matters as long as we know what we're looking for. So did the snap matter to me? Was I able to figure out, did that mean anything? That's one thing. But we know from those coaches, absolutely, they're evaluating everything at all times. And that's how you build a championship team. So, well, we had a situation where we were talking about spring games being boring last week, but I guess if it's going to be exciting, it's got to come down to sudden death. If that's any way to shake things up and make it exciting and get people's attention at the end of the game, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, it was funny. Shane Beamer mentioned that he really didn't have a plan for overtime because I don't think they were expecting that. So, yeah, the shootout was cool there in the end, the 2-point shootout. But I will say this on the boring or vanilla side, if you will. Dabble Loggins, the Gamecocks offensive coordinator, mentioned late last week, the vanilla ice cream comment. It's going to be vanilla. It's going to be boring, right? The offense is going to be boring. What we're going to call, we're not going to show anything. I actually thought, right, because there were so many SEC teams, I'm sure you know, Mark, that were breaking in new offensive coordinators. And for a lot of teams, that was a top storyline. Just what is their offense going to look like? I honestly thought for the play calling to be vanilla, I actually thought they were somewhat aggressive, going down the field, stretching the field vertically. I think they did that more in this spring game, if I recall correctly, than they did last year. So I was actually kind of surprised and impressed with the play calling. I'll say this, the first drive of the game was the best drive with Spencer Rattler, Juice Wells, Trey Knox, what looked like for the most part your starters, give or take a few guys because of the way they split up the teams. And to me, Mark, I'll say this, my takeaway and not drawing hard conclusions because I'm sure we saw just 1% of what the playbook will consist of, but it looked very similar to what they did in the Tennessee and the Clemson games late last year where they had so much success, which is, Mark, what I expected, right? I mean, I don't expect them to completely reinvent the wheel offensively. I think they're going to take things they really liked from last year. Dabble Loggins is going to put his own wrinkle. Shane Beamer and the offensive staff, they're going to add some wrinkles. But for the most part, Mark, I think you're going to continue to see kind of more of the same of what we saw late last year and kind of that same philosophy, if you will, spreading the ball out. I mean, they worked out a shotgun primarily the entire night. So, all in all, it was a fun spring game for sure. And I think, Mark, if you go into these spring games and you understand what they are and you can take them for what they are and not try to make it out into something it's not, I think you can thoroughly enjoy it. So and that's why I think, again, we come into this Monday with tons of takeaways and, like you mentioned, clues for maybe just what this team will look like this fall.
Chris, you mentioned the name Trey Knox. So he makes his way in from Arkansas. And that's one of the things about the spring game that makes it fun is you get to see the new players, whether those are true freshmen or incoming transfers, step on the field and wear your team's colors for the first time and see what they're all about. So any takeaway from some of the new guys?
Yeah, definitely Trey Knox. You mentioned him. Stood out tremendously, Mark. I think it was 4 catches for 60 yards. I get the stats pulled up here. But big body dude, I definitely think they've completely flipped the tight end position, right? This was a room that was ravaged by the portal or graduation. Nate Atkins, Jaheim Bell gone. Trey Kenyon retires due to injuries. Austin Stogner goes back to Oklahoma. And South Carolina had just no tight ends after the season, right? And it's a position they're going to utilize heavily in the offense. Again, you go out to the portal, you get a Trey Knox from Arkansas. You get a Joshua Simon from Western Kentucky. You get a Nick Elsknis, I think is how you say his last name, over from Florida. Connor Cox is a freshman. Actually, it's Reed McKeeska, I believe, is the transfer from Florida. I always get those two mixed up or whatever. Elsknis, another true freshman. So they have just completely flipped the tight end room. Trey Knox, to me, was really impressive. And you saw that chemistry, especially early on, which I don't think Spencer Rattler had with all of his new targets. Eddie Lewis, I think, being the most notable because they targeted him a lot. They went down the field, and Eddie Lewis, a transfer from Memphis. And what I really took away from that, Mark, is, and again, this is maybe drawing too much conclusions, looking too deep into it, but with the amount of targets he got from Spencer Rattler, it made me believe that maybe he's wide receiver too, going into summer and a fall camp, if you will. But Trey Knox, I think, was definitely one of the newcomers, Mark, that stood out. He's going to be a big-time target at tight end, a true tight end, if you will, just a big-body dude. Now, I said this, and I'm going to try to not sound disrespectful when I say it, but I think Trey Knox is going to be what folks thought Austin Stogner was going to be last year. And he just never really, Mark, lived up to the hype. I'm not sure he really had the speed to compete in this league, but we've seen Trey Knox do it before. And again, Saturday night, I think, just reaffirmed. Joshua Simon's been a guy with his athleticism that has really shown flashes during the spring. We've heard great things about him, and he showed that in the spring game. So I think maybe the loss of like a Jaheim Bell, Mark, is one that isn't felt as severely as some may have thought. Mario Anderson at running back, the Newberry transfer, I think that's a position they still need to go out in the portal and get a guy, but I thought he flashed. He showed you he could be a capable back there, and I think could be a nice supporting cast player. Again, I don't think he's RB1 necessarily, but I think he showed flashes of what he can do. And then outside of that, in regards to newcomers, I would say freshman quarterback Lenoris Sellers was really the talk of the spring game, Mark. I mean, and we love, right? It's not a successful spring game if you don't come out of your spring game talking about a quarterback that's not your starter, right? If you don't have some sort of like quarterback conversation, I feel like that's almost a rite of passage of a successful spring game. Lenoris Sellers, the true freshman from Florence, South Carolina. I mean, I really think if there's one thing, Mark, if you're talking about top 3 or 4 things we learned from the South Carolina spring game, there's a good chance Lenoris Sellers is the quarterback of the future. I mean, just when you look at the size, the speed, the athleticism, the arm strength, this was a 4-star kid. But he looks special. I mean, he looks special. And it's weird to come out of a spring game saying that a kid has the it factor, right? Because who's he going up? Who's he going up against? And how will he look when he gets in live fire against the Georgias, the Tennessees, the A&Ms, the Floridas, et cetera? So, but I think when you look at just his raw talent, his raw ability, he showed, Mark, that the ceiling is very high, and I think the future could be very bright for him on the defensive side. Jerron Willis from Ole Miss, the linebacker transfer, I thought he was flying around out there. Grayson Pup Howard, a true freshman, right, newcomer that I think will play a ton at that linebacker position. Jelon Kilgore, who I believe is actually a redshirt freshman, but he showed me some flashes. Elijah Davis at defensive tackle. And, outside of that, I would say those are the newcomers right now. And, of course, one big name, Mark, I did not mention. He was in the building Saturday night but did not play. Nicholas Harbert, who will get on campus this summer. And I think one of my big takeaways was when you look at the offense and the wide receiver room, I think there are question marks. I think he's going to have an opportunity to make some big-time impacts early on if he can get adjusted, acclimated, just because, again, it's hard to keep a guy like that off the field when you have that athleticism and that skill set. So, again, all in all, Mark, I know that was a long list, but a lot of newcomers. I mean, this team had a ton of guys. Hell, there may be some that I missed out on. For example, Nick Gargiulo at the center position. We got our first look at him, and really tough to evaluate an offensive line in a game like that, but certainly South Carolina, Mark, as you know, is a team that utilized the portal, and it just feels like there's a new roster and a bunch of new dudes every single year. And I guess that's sort of the fun of the spring game is seeing them for the first time.
I was going to go the backup quarterback route, but you filled me in right there because we're familiar with the name Luke Doty. So that was the name that I expected.
Yeah.
Okay, he's the backup quarterback. Nope, not necessarily. You got Sellers. You got Bailey in the mix.
Well, I was going to say this is that I don't know what the depth chart looks like right now. And, I'm one that I pride myself, Mark, on not having spring game hot takes, if you will, or overreactions, because I don't know. They're fun, but nobody really likes that guy that's coming into today's show that's like just trying to draw these hard conclusions and overreacting to a literal scrimmage. But if I do have one spring game hot take, one spring game overreaction, it is that I do not see how Luke Doty goes into the fall as QB2. I just, after watching him in the spring game, I was shocked how abysmal he looked. And I know he was in a green jersey, so things were a little bit different. The offensive line was really shoddy, makeshift offensive line. I think they gave up over 10 sacks in the game, Mark, which what does it really mean? Who knows? But so I think there were some things that limited Doty, but just watching him and then seeing the upside of a young guy like a Lenoris Sellers and the talent and the ability and what he can do, I think most of this fan base has sold their stock on Luke Doty ever being this team's starting quarterback, ever leading this program under center. And I think I'm right there with them. So the good news is QB2 is not going to play a lot, if at all, this year, right, Mark? I mean, we're not going to see this is Spencer Rattler's team. Knock on wood, barring injury, we're not going to see anybody else hardly, unless it's in mop-up duty, right? So the good news is this really isn't a big deal until next year, when I'm sure you and I will be talking a year from now, talking about the quarterback battle in spring for South Carolina. But I was surprised how poorly he played, and it just, again, would not surprise me at all if Lenoris Sellers is in QB2. Like you mentioned, I thought Tanner Bailey did some good things, Braden Davis here and there. The other takeaway, Mark, is this. The portal is now open. I'd be shocked if at minimum one guy out of that room did not enter the portal, because, I mean, you've got like 6 guys, and obviously they can't all play, right? So I think the coaches will be having some very real conversations with some of those guys this week, and if they stay on campus and they just want to be Gamecocks, great. But I think if these are guys that want to go find playing time, I think there's a potential that a couple of them could hit the portal and try to do so.
One quick note on the injury front: Jalen Nichols, projected starting offensive lineman, taken off the field and limping off the field. So that was one of your big points last week, was stay healthy. Yeah. And it's almost impossible to completely do that. So pretty good injury report there, but he was
And Beamer, I think they're going to give the update today on him. We're speaking on Monday. He was helped off the field. I mean, he did walk off, but walk off very gingerly. So you just hope it's one of those things, even if it's like a sprained ankle or what have you, that it's not something obviously that'll linger into fall camp or certainly keeping him out of the season. So I think the Gamecocks got out of it pretty healthy outside of a couple stingers, but certainly Nichols was the most notable. That I mean, you hate to see that anytime, right, Mark? A freaking starting offensive lineman, a veteran. I think he's a senior, so hopefully nothing too severe.
And Chris, you mentioned the transfer portal. Well, the floodgates are opened. While everybody was playing spring games, or most of the teams across college football on Saturday, the transfer portal was wide open, and we got all sorts of announcements. So not necessarily needing to talk about Anthony Rose. I looked him up because I thought, okay, Anthony Rose, what did this guy do? Well, he did nothing, and that's one of the reasons why he's transferring. He was a top 400 prospect and a top 50 player in the state of Florida. But here we go with the transfer portal.
Well, and Anthony Rose, and I almost hate to bring it up, Mark, but I think this context is necessary. He is one of the 3 players that was arrested in early February and was suspended indefinitely from the football program. So I think it's one of those things, and the arrest was on gun charges. There was a possession of a firearm on campus, and I'm sure you know, Mark, that is a huge no-no to have a gun on campus. And so it's probably one of those things where, I mean, if he ever wanted to play football again, he had to get out of Columbia. I just don't see that he had a future at South Carolina. So, it's really unfortunate, and most of these guys will leave just sheerly because of playing time or what have you. So the Rose situation is a little bit different, and, I mean, you hate to see it. Now you wonder, what are the other 2 guys going to do? Montague Rames and Cameron Upshaw, the other 2 guys who were arrested along with Anthony Rose. But, I mean, the portal's wide open. Let the Wild Wild West begin, my friend. And I think South Carolina will be a team that will be active. I mean, we've already heard, Mark, that a couple of weeks ago they had a Florida State defensive end. I forget his name, but they had him on campus visiting. So that edge and I think running back are going to be the areas of focus, because when I look at, Mark, all right, now spring is concluded. We go into a long, quote-unquote, off-season, if you will. Granted, there's no off-season for folks like you and I. But as you go into the summer, what are the biggest question marks for the Gamecocks on this roster? And I still say it's running back and edge, right? DeCabrion Joyner at running back, we've gone this far, Mark, without talking about it. That was something I told you was a huge storyline going into the game. And I thought DeCabrion Joyner, listen, he looked like the athlete we all know he is. He looks comfortable with the football in his hands. He did some nice things. He had some nice runs. But there's nobody, Mark, that I look at on the roster right now and I say that's RB1, right? Like, it's 4th and short. We need a first down. I still don't really know who I'm handing the ball off to. You know what I mean? And if for nothing else, for competition purposes, I think it would make sense to bring in a proven Power 5 back, has experience at this level, and he's done it before at a high level. So I think you'll see them be active at both running back and edge. I think if they could add another top wide receiver, I think that would be ideal as well, because I think outside of Juice Wells, the question now becomes, who is wide receiver 2? Like, who is that next guy? I know the tight end room's really good, but you'd like to have another viable option on the outside, if you will. Also, if they could add guys, I mean, Shane Beamer will add anybody. I think they could help the football team, but the linebacker position, always a position of need, it seems like, for us. Somebody in the secondary that could help you. I think they're pretty set there, but quality depth is a great thing. So, but running back and edge are the two positions of priority, if you will. But hey, certainly the portal, it taketh and it giveth, and I'm sure it'll hit South Carolina, and so we shall see. And we're just like every other college coach. I feel like, Mark, we're just sort of bracing for impact as what the portal will do over the next 13 days or so.
I check it a few times every day, especially this time of year. There you go, everyone. Chris says edge rusher, running back, need those in the summer. But he's got a whole lot more takes from both spring and from everything else going on with South Carolina football. So get on over to the Daily Crow and the Spurs Up Show. The best way to find all your work, Chris.
Yeah, I would say social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, TikTok, you name it, we're there. Also, the podcast drops Monday, Thursday on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts at the Spurs Up Show. And like you mentioned, Mark, the Daily Crow is our daily live show, noon to 2, which airs on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We take questions, comments, calls, and a podcast version of that show drops at 3 o'clock on that same exact Spurs Up Show podcast feed. So really just look us up at the Spurs Up Show and you'll find all our work. And I appreciate you as always, Mark. Great conversation and great catching up with you.